Hello, and welcome to this episode of Peace in the Time of Pandemic, a summer video short series from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, part of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. I'm Ernesto Verdeja, Associate Professor of Political Science and Peace Studies and Director of the undergraduate program here at the Kroc Institute. And I'm joined today by Walter Scheirer, Assistant Professor in the Notre Dame Department of Computer Science and Engineering and a Kroc Institute Faculty Fellow. Today, we're going to be talking about new directions in atrocity prevention work, combining advanced computer science developments with peace studies research and practice on early warning and risk assessments of violence. So let's go ahead and begin. Let's talk a little bit about this early warning and artificial intelligence project that we've been working on. Walter, let's start with you. How did computer scientists like you end up working in this area?
It's a great question, Ernesto, because it's an unusual mix of topics. So I've been on the internet, relatively speaking, a pretty long time, since the mid-1990s. And I've been watching the evolution of communication on the internet from, basically then until now. And I've noticed some pretty big changes over time. Communications channels have changed, the way people communicate on the internet has changed. And those changes have not always been positive. Back in the early era of the internet, it was kind of rowdy, but civil enough where you could have interesting conversations. And the volume of discourse wasn't nearly at the level it is now. All of that changes as social media becomes popular in the early 2000s. Smartphones become the primary way in which people communicate, reach the internet, talk to others. And the nature of the communication has also changed. Folks aren't just typing messages to each other, they're sending images and videos. And as more and more ordinary folks join the internet, you receive many more perspectives on different topics, but also some of the messaging has become more antisocial. As politics has become a very hot topic on the internet, the nature of the messaging has changed to become more and more negative over time. And just, again, being a passive observer watching communication on the internet, I've become more and more alarmed by what I see. Memes, for instance, right? These fun messages in the beginning have changed to carry more insidious messages, things that in some cases are outright calls to violence. And at a certain point, I sort of said to myself, I need to do something about this. Is there something my research can do to address all of the negative messaging on the internet, to try to filter out what's signal, what's noise, what types of messaging should political scientists, should NGOs, should journalists, should human rights folks be paying attention to, because they may be signaling, right, a warning that something bad is going to happen in the future. And so my lab for many years has worked on media forensics, which is an area of computer science, which asks the question, is this content real or not? Has it been manipulated in some way? Is this scene real, or is it generated via computer graphics? Ordinary people on the internet, when they look at, say, an internet meme, or maybe just some other image in a photo collection, they can't discern whether or not this image has been manipulated if the manipulations are really good, right? You have to turn to capabilities in image processing, computer vision, artificial intelligence to make those decisions. This was a sleepy area of computer science for a number of years, and is now becoming a very, very hot topic because it can help us address this. So that's kind of the context in which I, joined this project and have been thinking about these things. So Ernesto, why don't you tell us a little bit about violence early warning in its traditional form? How has it been articulated in the past? How has it been used? Interested in sort of setting the stage here to talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah, so I think it's, so thanks for that, Walter. I think, one thing to keep in mind here is that this project is an effort at trying to bring together these different computational approaches to advance peace studies practice and peace studies research, right? So there's a really kind of exciting area here of overlap. But to get a better sense of that, maybe I can say a few things about risk assessment and early warning. So normally when we think of what the causes of violence are and how to kind of approach them, we normally look kind of anecdotally at all these different cases. We look at different factors. We say, for instance, if a country has a long history of discrimination and some violence against a vulnerable group, we say that country might have a likelihood of violence in the future. Makes sense. This is kind of a standard indicator. What we've been trying to do with this project, however, is to try to think more systematically about major early warning indicators that can be used across a lot of different cases. So when we think of early warning and risk assessment, the research has consistently showed a few things. In terms of risk assessments, which are kind of these big, large-scale factors that elevate the risk of mass atrocities in the near or midterm, we've identified pretty well what those are. So we know, for instance, countries that have a history of political violence against a minority group are already more likely to be predisposed to violence if that's never been punished in the past. So that's an important factor. We also know that regime type matters. So countries that are authoritarian rather than democratic tend to be more likely to commit mass violence, especially mass atrocities like mass killings in the future. So authoritarian regimes are just more likely to do this because they don't have accountability. They're more likely to use the security forces to solve their political problems. We also know that countries undergoing severe crises like economic crises, political crises, but even now with COVID, of course, other types of crises that can add additional pressures on to the ruling elite, who may be struggling even more to try to maintain power. So crises are really, really important indicators. They elevate the risk of mass violence in the future. And then, of course, we know that countries that generally have a history of discriminatory practices towards minority groups are more likely to engage in violence in the future. So those are kind of big risk assessment things. And we have a pretty good sense of what that entails, both at the research level and also at the policy level for prevention purposes. What's a little bit harder is to think about early warning. And what I mean by early warning, what we're trying to do with this project is to identify kind of the short and midterm factors that can escalate, that can explain kind of the tipping points or the points in time when violence is likely to happen. So it's one thing to say that we know what the general risk of a country is. It's at higher risk than another country to engage in mass atrocities. It's a different thing to say, should we be worried 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now? How do we prioritize different countries? And that's what early warning is. And so this project is very much about trying to bring in these different types of techniques to understand what can effectively function as early warning indicators of mass violence in the near future. So that's kind of the general way of thinking about it. Now, maybe to kind of understand what that entails in a little bit more detail, Walter, I think it's worthwhile asking you a bit to talk about artificial intelligence, since this plays a really central role on this particular project of early warning. So if you could say a little bit about that, would be great.
Absolutely. So I think when most people think about artificial intelligence, they're thinking about science fiction, the movies, all these fantastic things, right, that seem like they may be possible. Turns out in computer science, artificial intelligence is a bit more narrow. We can do some pretty amazing things by teaching computers from data to perform certain tasks. But where this works well is purely in perceptual domains. So you could imagine having an artificial visual system that can sense information from the world and perform basic pattern recognition and then make decisions based on those pattern recognition activities. But that's basically it. It's not thinking, it's not reasoning through problems, which is again what we would see, androids doing in a movie. It's a bit more basic, but what's nice about this is it gives us the tools we need to parse data that we find on the internet. That could be textual data, that could be visual data, in real time, at scale. And this is great because the scale of the data is so large that individual observers can't go through all of it. It's just impossible, right? There's no organization large enough to watch the internet in real time. So this perceptual AI becomes a really nice mechanism for doing this.
Okay, so one way to think of it then is that artificial intelligence in this project, what it seeks to do is to be able to analyze enormous amounts of data on the internet in real time and give us a sense as to whether there is social media content that seems to be pointing in the direction of targeting and discriminating against certain groups in a way that promotes misinformation or disinformation. Is that Is that a fair?
Absolutely. Those are the patterns we're looking for. We can train the system on instances of these images or videos, right? Showing these negative messages, and we can say, look for more instances of these, but not the exact ones, right? Things that kind of, are in the same vein.
Okay. Could you say a little bit about how the project started? The original iteration of this, of course, involves you working with a couple of other people before I joined. So maybe we could hear a little bit about the origins of this before I came on board.
This project really starts a couple of years ago. I was on a panel on artificial intelligence with Michael Jankowski, who is a PhD student in the Kroc Institute. Michael is an interesting guy in that he has a background in computer science, but then went into social science, peace studies, and theology. But bringing these different disciplines together, allows you to see these problems, I think, in a more comprehensive way. And so chatting after that panel discussion, we've had a lot of mutual interests. We were both very concerned about what we had been seeing on the internet. And we decided to join forces and try to build a project that would create an early warning system that worked. Again, there's been discussions about this, and there have been some other prototype systems looking at very specific aspects of this problem. But we wanted to go bigger, right? We wanted to see how far we could push this. Looking at recent developments coming out of my lab and some other labs. We also linked up with Tim Wenninger in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering. Tim has been studying for a number of years disinformation on the internet and social media, but looking at it from a text-based perspective. But we wanted to bring in that modality as well. And then we approached Ernesto, right, who of course is an expert in mass atrocity, genocide, trying to understand, what are the threats? Like, what really should we be looking at? How can we refine the system to look for things that are relevant? So bringing together this interdisciplinary group, right, which has coverage in all these different areas, we've been able to make some really interesting, good progress.
Yeah, it's great. One of the things I'm excited about this project is the way it allows us to think more systematically about the short-term and kind of mid-term drivers and indicators of violence. Because even though, again, we know what the general kind of risk indicators are, we know what the major large-scale conditions and factors are for large-scale violence, for mass atrocities, we have less of an understanding of being able to explain timing. And this is important for policy purposes. It's not just of research interest, but it's also important for the folks in the UN or at different kind of regional organizations or in civil society groups or in Washington, D.C., who are trying to think about, look, I've got all these different countries, all these different cases that I should be concerned about. How do I prioritize which ones I should be worried about in the short term, but also in the long term, the ones that are kind of on the horizon, but we're not really paying attention to. And so I think in a lot of ways, a project like this, what it can do is can help contribute to thinking about prevention policy by helping people understand what are the potential drivers that are kind of otherwise missed under the surface, under the noise of everyday news, so we can think a little bit more proactively rather than reactively to prevention work. So this is one reason why I'm really excited about this. And to my knowledge, having done this kind of stuff now for a number of years and worked with policy folks on prevention work around genocide and mass atrocities, to my knowledge, there really isn't any systematic efforts in this way to look at early warning drivers. There's a lot of really excellent early warning work done on particular cases, and we have a general understanding of what some of the main triggers and tipping points are, but we don't have a good way of thinking about the role of social media. And of course, needless to say, this is where a lot of information is produced. It's incredibly data rich. So this project, I think, has the potential to contribute to a lot of this prevention work. So I'm really excited to be a part of it as well, even though sadly it's something that's needed, right? And so it'll be nice the day that we can kind of move on and don't have to do this work anymore. I thought maybe we could just, in the last few minutes that we have, Walter, we could talk a little bit about how the current pandemic and kind of what's going on in the world today affects the possibilities for violent atrocities or complicate prevention efforts. And I thought maybe we could start with you because you've been thinking about this from the perspective of Indonesia, but also looking more generally at the role of social media in the current context.
Yeah, that's right. So for about 2 years now, we've been looking at Indonesia as a case study, trying to understand what types of disinformation are being spread on social media, really focused on image-based memes and understanding the messaging. And what we've seen in the Indonesian case, the news has a dramatic effect on the messaging. And so there was a very contested, very heated election last year in Indonesia. And of course, that was a main driver. But along the way, there were all sorts of other incidents that occurred. For instance, there was a plane crash, right? And various political parties tried to co-opt that message. There is continual concern about regional actors in the Pacific. And different news stories, right, circulating have played a role, in the politics surrounding not just the election, but the day-to-day governance of Indonesia. And so now, of course, we come to the pandemic, right, which originates, in this region and shows up in Indonesian social media memes and is also showing up now globally everywhere. And the messaging is quite alarming. There is a tremendous amount of anti-Chinese messaging. Again, not just in the Pacific region, right, where tensions are always very high, but now in the United States, right, where there had been growing tensions. And so we've seen, looking at different memes that we've collected, outright racist messages, which, anecdotally have led to some instances of violence, which is not good. We do not want to see discrimination against any group. And now with the pandemic, this is exactly what we are starting to see. So to what extent does that grow, right? If we look at all of this messaging on the internet, the signs are not great. And so the question now is, how do we mitigate this situation?
Yeah. I think that's really important, right? There's so many moving parts here. And in fact, if we take a step back and kind of look at the more macro perspective as well, we can see that the current COVID crisis, the current coronavirus crisis, as well as the economic crisis that's affected the globe, these can be major drivers of political instability and also state repression. So one of the things we know, for instance, is that under conditions like this, governments tend to strengthen their security apparatus. It's hard for civil society groups advocating for human rights and for justice efforts. It's a lot more difficult for them to organize and protect the most vulnerable groups in their population. So that's an important consequence of this. Secondly, we know that states are just more likely to use violence. They can take advantage effectively of this new kind of opportunity, this crisis opportunity, to put into effect even more repressive measures. And we've seen this in a number of different countries, from authoritarian countries to countries that are kind of soft authoritarian. We've seen it even in parts of Europe, like in Hungary, which has a right-wing kind of populist hard man leader. So we see these things as kind of major consequences of how the current crisis can kind of drive the potential for violence around the world. And generally, of course, these types of crises, they weaken governance structures. So kind of connected to what you're talking about, by weakening governing structures, it means effectively that the governments are less likely to be able to put into effect their own policies, so they're more likely to actually respond violently or aggressively towards any kind of contestation towards their power. So what does this mean practically? It means basically that we need to be on the lookout for how, under these conditions of crisis, how social media can be used to create scapegoats. That government leaders, but also even opposition groups, et cetera, use scapegoats of populations that already have a history of being vulnerable. They already have a history of being targeted for racism or on religious grounds, et cetera. We see some of that in the United States. Even though the United States isn't experiencing anything like mass atrocities in other parts of the world, we see it even coming from our own political leaders, where there's kind of a consistent use of discriminatory and hateful discourse and marginalization of vulnerable groups to kind of score political points. So social media is a really important terrain for this, for getting kind of a sense of a pulse of what's going on. And in that respect, projects like this can hopefully aid some of this prevention work by helping identify where the stuff is bubbling up, so we can kind of intervene and try to prevent it or mitigate it to some extent. Yeah. So I think we are a little bit short on time here. We can kind of wrap this up, and I just wanted to take this moment and thank you, Walter, for joining and being a part of this conversation. It's always nice to see you, even though we're removed from each other and we can't be together in person. It's really nice having this conversation. So thanks so much.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.